You may remember that in the very first presentation of this course, we discussed how the government team has the right to define. And the right to define just means that the government team gets to define all of the relevant terms in the round, as well as decide the case type, the weighing mechanism, the value, the voting criteria, etc. So, what happens if the government team is unfair? Well, in that case, the opposition team gets to argue against the government team's framework. And that's what this presentation is going to be discussing. Well, what is abuse? The government team is abusive when they set up a top of case that skews the opposition team out of bounds. For example, say the resolution is this House should subsidize green energy vehicle owners. Now, the government team may define the voting criteria as net benefits for green energy vehicle owners. This is abusive or unfair because it means that what the opposition team now has a burden of doing is somehow proving that subsidizing green energy vehicles is going to be bad for the owners, which is simply not true. In this case, the government team has turned this debate into a truism. And because of that, the opposition team must act. If that's unfair, what do? The opposition team can run a special kind of argument called a topicality, in which they argue abuse. Now, here's what you need to pay attention to. You should only run a topicality if you have no other choice, because the government team is being so incredibly abusive that you have no choice but to argue against the framework. There are two reasons. The first is that a topicality is oftentimes misunderstood by lay or inexperienced judges, and you want the most clear debate possible. So if you're unclear, then the judge is obviously going to vote against you. That's why running a topicality can be risky, and so you may not want to do so unless necessary. The second reason why is that a topicality is what's called an a priori issue. That means that the judge is going to look at the topicality first to decide who won the round. So, you know how in a policy case, in general, the plan is what's most important? Well, in a case where the government team is abusive, the topicality tends to be the most important thing in the round. That essentially means that if you run an unwarranted topicality, then you're probably going to lose the topicality. And in that case, you're probably going to lose the round. So please be careful and proceed with caution when it comes to topicalities. They're confusing and they're only necessary when the government team is being very abusive. Well, what is a topicality? A topicality is a formal argument used to argue abuse on the top of case. Let's look at the structure. It has interpretation, violation, standards, and voters. Let's begin with the first half. The interpretation is what the government team said. What are you running the topicality on? The violation is what they did that was bad. Say what they did was bad because blank. The violation includes a counter definition, which is an alternative definition to make the round fairer. Essentially, the opposition team is arguing, no, what the government team said was abusive, thus we present this alternative definition for a fairer, more debatable, more educational round. Next, we have standards and voters. So say that the resolution is the USFG should take action to reduce the effects of climate change, and the government team defines a case type as fact. Now, if we want to run a topicality on the case type fact, then we begin with the interpretation, and the opposition team says the government team defined the case type as fact. That's what they did that was abusive. Now, the violation is that this is abusive because Gov is refusing to undergo the burden of solving a problem, taking away off grounds. As you'll notice, this resolution is clearly a policy. First of all, the USFG is an actor. Then we have the word should, which implies action. And finally, we quite literally have the words take action. This could not more clearly be a policy. And the violation, the opposition team explains how it's abusive to turn a policy round into a fact round, simply because the most difficult burden for the government team to meet in a policy round is to pass a plan by proving that the plan both solves a problem and is more good than harm. In making this a fact round, the government team gets to surpass that burden, making it so that the opposition team can no longer delink the plan from solvency or prove that it does more harm than good. Because of that, it's abusive. And that's all encompassed in this summary of a violation. Now, in the violation, you also introduce the counter definition. The opposition team proposes running this case as a policy. So you'll note that topicalities don't have to always be run on definitions. They can be run on the case type, weighing mechanism, voting criteria, or value, as long as it comes out in the top of case, or the framework. So let's return to the structure. We just did the interpretation and the violation. Next is the standards. Now, the standards are arguments, brief individual arguments, proving that the violation is true. It was abusive because ... So here are some common standards. Now, the first one is grounds. The opposition team can argue that the government team took away more grounds from the op than from the gov. The way you run it is by saying our very first standard is grounds. We believe on the opposition side that the government team took away more arguments from the op than from the gov because blank. It can help to introduce actual arguments that you were going to run, but that you no longer could because of the abusive government team's definitions. For example, say, let's return back to the resolution about green energy vehicles, and remember that the voting criteria was net benefits for owners of these green energy vehicles. Now, one argument was that the opposition side should say, we were going to run an argument about the economy, but that no longer stands true because these green energy owners are going to be subsidized, meaning that their economic prospects will obviously be benefited by this plan. Now I'll move on to education, or why the abuse diminishes the education. So it's pretty easy to argue education, just say they took away our grounds, they made this no longer debatable, so we can no longer have an educational discussion. Author's intent, not how the author of the resolution wanted the debate run. So let's say that the resolution is about Trump, and the government team decides to define Trump as Melania Trump. That obviously is not the intent of the author of the resolution, so you can run that standard. Fourthly, we have fairness, or why the government team is being unfair. Most topicalities will at least have the three standards: grounds, education, and fairness, simply because they generally apply to all abuse. Author's intent is more specific, but is still relatively common. These four standards are less common. We begin with grammar. You can argue that the counter definition is more grammatically correct. Specifically, let's say the resolution has a plural word. For instance, the USFG should take steps plural, to address this problem. In that case, if the government team defines steps as something singular and runs a plan with one plank as opposed to several, then they are being abusive, because it is more difficult for the government team to pass a plan with several planks than with just one. So one potential counter definition is steps, plural. Next, we have dictionary. You can argue that the counter definition better adheres to the dictionary. If the counter definition is a dictionary definition, whereas the original definition is not, then you can run this standard. You also have common usage, or you could argue that the counter definition is used more in everyday settings. So let's return to the resolution about Trump. So if the government team defines Trump as Melania Trump, then we could argue that it violates common usage, as in general, when I say the word Trump, we think of Donald Trump, the former president of the US, not his wife. Finally, we have predictability. You could argue that the framework is unexpected. Now, this is a slightly more risky standard to run, as many judges believe that the government team does not have the burden of predictability, and that they can run any definitions as long as they are debatable, not necessarily predictable. One common standard that is similar to predictability is prep time. The opposition team could argue that the government team took away their prep time by being unpredictable. However, this once again is risky, as some judges have the paradigm that, again, the government team does not have to be predictable, just debatable. Let's look at an example where you could potentially run the standard of predictability. Well, here's something you could do. You could say, well, the resolution was this House should implement a universal basic income. Now, on the opposition side, on the government side, what if they define this House as a random country as opposed to the US? So, for instance, Guatemala, Nigeria, just a random country. Then, on the opposition side, if your arguments no longer apply because of this random definition of this House, you could run the standard of predictability. This kind of case that is hyper-specific is called a spec case. Spec short for specific. Now, let's just remember that there are many different kinds of standards, not just 8, but these 8 are the most common, especially the first 4. Now let's move on to voters. Now, in the voters, the opposition team explains why the judge should vote for the topicality. Maybe you prove that if the topicality is bought, then the debate will be more educational and debatable. You also have to bring up the idea that this is an a priori issue. Remind the judge that it's the first thing they'll look at when they decide to vote. Now, how does the government team respond to a topicality? Number one, first and foremost, note that the government team does have to respond because a topicality is an a priori issue. The government team responds by explaining why their top of case is still debatable by attacking their standards. For instance, you say, we meet this standard because blank. For example, we meet the standard of grounds because the opposition team is no more skewed out of grounds than the government team. We meet the standard of education because the definition is actually more educational than the counter definition. Explain. Try to refute every single standard. Note that once again, 3 to 5 standards are recommended. Here's another potential, though less common strategy. You could actually run counter standards. Now, note that the opposition team is still introducing a definition, it's just called a counter definition. So, if you believe that the definition originally presented by the government side is more debatable and educational than the counter definition, you can run standards, specifically counter standards, against the counter definition. And these standards still apply. You can run the counter standards of grounds, education, author's intent, fairness, etc.